The galactic tournament was unlike any event in the galaxy. The arena, larger than most planets' capital cities, glimmered with energy, as if the very air hummed with anticipation. Beings from every corner of the known universe gathered, filling the stands with a kaleidoscope of colors and forms. Some towered over the others with multiple limbs or glowing skin, while others were small but radiated an intense intellect. The galactic tournament was the pinnacle of competition, a place where strength, cunning, and sheer will were tested in ways that transcended physical limits. In the midst of this awe-inspiring gathering, Captain Marcus stood on the fringes, a human veteran who had seen more battlefields than most could imagine. Retired from active duty, Marcus no longer fought in wars that spanned galaxies, yet he found himself here, feeling more out of place than ever. The galactic tournament was for the best and brightest, beings who represented their species' most formidable traits. In a galaxy teeming with advanced lifeforms, a retired human soldier seemed irrelevant. Marcus wasn't here as a competitor. His purpose was different, and he knew it all too well. He had been assigned to guide and protect someone, a young alien boy named Lior, who represented a species renowned for their intellect but not their physical prowess. Lior's race, the Arathians, valued intellect above all, but that very intellect had left Lior vulnerable. Paralyzed from the waist down after a tragic accident, he now sat in a sleek wheelchair, physically fragile but with a mind sharper than any weapon. The Arathians had been eager to prove their strategic genius, but Lior's injury had turned him into an outcast, a symbol of weakness in a competition that prided itself on strength. And here, in the middle of this immense arena, surrounded by beings who could level mountains or outthink computers, Lior felt the weight of his perceived inadequacy more than ever. His large, deep-set eyes, characteristic of his species, carried the burden of being judged long before the tournament had even begun. Marcus, standing tall but worn by years of conflict, watched the crowd in silence. The roar of the audience echoed through the arena as the competitors prepared for the first phase of the tournament. Each species sent their best: warriors, strategists, engineers. But Lior, small and seemingly fragile, sat motionless, his eyes scanning the scene with quiet resignation. Marcus couldn't help but see a reflection of his younger self in the boy, before battle-hardened years had shaped him into someone who had long abandoned the need for recognition. In Lior, Marcus saw potential, but the boy was too lost in his own despair to see it himself. The years of battle had taught Marcus that wars were not only fought on battlefields, and victory often came to those who could endure, not just physically but mentally. But how could he convince Lior of that when the boy had already resigned himself to failure? Lior's voice, calm and mechanical due to the neural implants in his throat, interrupted Marcus's thoughts. "There's no place for weakness here," he muttered, staring out at the competitors warming up for the tournament's first phase. His tone carried a bitterness that Marcus had heard in soldiers who had lost everything on the battlefield. It was the sound of someone who had given up. Marcus crouched beside Lior's chair, his weathered hand resting lightly on the metallic armrest. He didn't speak at first. He knew words alone wouldn't break through the wall of self-doubt that Lior had built around himself. Instead, he watched the boy's face, searching for some flicker of hope, of fight, anything that could prove Lior hadn't fully succumbed to the despair that clung to him like a shadow. But Lior's expression remained unreadable, those large eyes reflecting only the chaos of the tournament preparations. Marcus felt a pang of frustration. He had been tasked with this, guiding the tournament's weakest link, and yet he felt powerless in the face of the boy's overwhelming self-defeat. His mind drifted back to the battlefield, to comrades who had given up hope long before their time. He had failed them. He couldn't fail Lior. "You think strength is just muscle and might?" Marcus finally said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "You're wrong, kid. I've seen stronger men break from things you wouldn't believe. What makes you weak isn't your legs, it's that you've already convinced yourself you've lost." Lior turned his head slightly, but his gaze didn't meet Marcus's. "I'm not like them," he said softly. "They're warriors. I was just a strategist. Now I'm not even that. I can't win without." He trailed off, his eyes dropping to his legs, the weight of his condition clear in every word he didn't say. Marcus straightened, frustration bubbling inside him, but he kept it at bay. You don't need legs to fight. Not here. He tapped the side of his temple. You win the real battle in here. But Lior remained silent, his gaze still on the competitors who had already begun their warm-ups, towering figures that made Lior's small frame seem insignificant. The hum of the arena intensified as the tournament's official broadcast began, showing each contestant's profile, their homeworlds, their achievements. The crowd cheered louder for those known for their feats of strength, or their unmatched skill in warfare. Lior's name appeared briefly, accompanied by a polite but subdued reaction. The boy flinched at the sight of it, and Marcus saw it. The moment of shame, the moment where Lior's belief in his own irrelevance deepened. He wanted to shake the boy, to make him understand that this tournament wasn't about proving himself to the galaxy. It was about proving himself to himself. The announcement rang out, signaling the start of the tournament's first phase, a tactical challenge that required contestants to outwit their opponents and claim control of strategic points in the arena. It was Lior's chance, his moment to prove that his mind, at least, was still sharp, still capable. Yet the boy remained still, his hands unmoving on the controls of his wheelchair. Marcus leaned down, his voice low and fierce. I've seen men with everything lose it all because they gave up before the fight even started. Don't you dare be one of them. Lior's fingers twitched slightly, a small but significant motion that Marcus didn't miss. There was still fight in him, buried deep, but it was there. Marcus just had to draw it out, to make Lior believe in his own worth again. But time was running out. The tournament had begun, and soon, it would be too late to make a difference. Lior finally met Marcus's gaze, his expression still guarded, but there was a flicker of something else in those deep-set eyes. You don't understand, he said, his voice barely audible over the roar of the crowd. There's no place for weakness here. Marcus stood tall, his presence a steady force beside the boy. You're not weak, Lior. Not unless you make yourself believe it. The tournament's first round was seconds away, and Marcus could only hope that his words would sink in before it was too late. The noise of the tournament echoed faintly in the background as Lior sat in silence, his hands resting motionless on the arms of his chair. Marcus had seen this before, a soldier, even one who had never set foot on a battlefield, consumed by doubt and despair. It was the same darkness he had once carried himself. Lior didn't need to say it, but Marcus could feel the weight of defeat settling in the boy's chest. It was in the way Lior looked at the other competitors, the way his eyes dropped whenever someone glanced his way, as if he could already see the judgment and dismissal in their gaze. I used to be someone, Lior murmured, breaking the silence between them. His voice, though altered by the neural implants, carried a heaviness that Marcus recognized. Back home, I was the best. I could outmaneuver anyone. It didn't matter how strong they were, how fast, they couldn't beat me. But now... His voice trailed off, and he glanced down at his legs, the muscles limp, the mechanical chair beneath him more prison than support. Now none of it matters. Marcus leaned back, the familiar ache of long-buried memories stirring within him. He had felt that same hollowness, the gnawing sense that everything he'd once been had vanished, leaving behind only the shadow of who he was. But he didn't say anything yet. He needed Lior to open up, to confront the pain he had been burying, just as Marcus had been forced to do years ago. You think the galaxy only cares about strength? Marcus said quietly, not as a question but as a statement. Lior's silence was answer enough. But it's not true. You're worth more than you know. You were never about physical power. Lior's bitter laugh interrupted him. That's easy for you to say. You're human. Your kind thrives on physical strength, on action. His voice cracked, but he quickly regained control. I can't even stand. I can't fight. What am I supposed to be worth when I can't even hold my own weight? Marcus felt the pull of his own past like an undertow, dragging him back to the memories he tried so hard to forget. The smell of burning metal, the screams of his comrades, the overwhelming guilt that gnawed at him every day since that mission. He had lost everything, his unit, his sense of purpose, and for a while, even his will to keep going. The war had left him with more scars than just the ones on his body, and the hardest wound to heal was the one that lived in his mind. But in Lior, he saw a version of himself. Broken, but not beyond repair. There was a time, Marcus began slowly, his voice rough from the memories, when I believed I was done too. I'd led my unit into a battle I thought we could win. We were outnumbered, outgunned, but I believed our strategy would pull us through. I was wrong. His jaw tightened, the pain still sharp after all these years. I lost them. Every last one of them. And for a long time, I thought that meant I'd lost myself too. Lior looked at him, those large, dark eyes blinking slowly. Marcus continued, his voice steady now. I carried that with me for years. I thought I wasn't worth anything anymore because I'd failed. I thought the galaxy had no place for me. But I was wrong. What changed? Lior asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and disbelief. I realized that strength isn't about what you've lost. It's about what you can still do, no matter how broken you feel. I couldn't bring my unit back, but I could learn from it. I could use what I still had, my experience, my mind, my heart, and make sure I never failed like that again. Marcus's eyes hardened. You think because you can't walk, because you've lost your legs, that you're not worth anything? You're wrong. You've still got your mind, and that's stronger than anything these other competitors have. Lior looked away, the silence between them stretching out once more. But Marcus could see the shift, the way the boy's hands clenched slightly, the tension in his posture. He wasn't giving up yet, not entirely. And that was all Marcus needed to see. The hours passed slowly as the tournament continued in the background, but Marcus knew Lior wasn't ready to face the next phase just yet. He had to rebuild his confidence, brick by brick, and Marcus wasn't about to let him do it alone. In the quiet moments, Marcus shared stories of old battles, victories won not by brute force, but by clever strategies, outthinking enemies who believed they had already won. He told Lior of great commanders who turned the tide of war with nothing but their minds, of soldiers who fought on even when their bodies failed them. Slowly, he could see the stories begin to sink in, like seeds being planted in Lior's heart, waiting to grow. But there were moments of doubt. During a training simulation, when Lior's strategic brilliance began to show, his excitement quickly soured as his body failed him again. The simulation required quick reflexes, and his paralysis meant he couldn't respond fast enough. His plan unraveled, and his frustration grew. I can't do this, Lior muttered, his voice heavy with defeat. It's not enough. I'm not enough. Marcus knelt beside him, his voice low but firm. The body isn't the battlefield, Lior. It never was. The battle's in your head. That's where you win. And you can win. Lior didn't respond immediately. His gaze flickered between the simulation screen and Marcus, his thoughts swirling behind his guarded expression. But Marcus could see it again, that tiny flicker of hope, struggling to break through the layers of doubt and self-loathing. The boy took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly as he placed them back on the controls. Maybe, he whispered, more to himself than to Marcus. Maybe there's still a way to win this. Marcus nodded, standing tall again. He didn't need to say anything more. The decision was Lior's, and Lior alone. But for the first time, Marcus felt the slightest surge of hope, not just for the boy, but for himself as well. He wasn't just guiding Lior through the tournament, he was finding his own way back, piece by piece. The tournament roared on, but in that moment, amidst the chaos and competition, something shifted. Lior wasn't just a boy in a wheelchair anymore. He was a strategist, a competitor, and perhaps, most importantly, someone who had yet to realize just how strong he truly was. And for the first time in years, Marcus allowed himself to believe that they could both win this battle. The moment the strategic phase of the tournament began, Lior felt the weight of the neural link snap into place. His vision blurred for a second before it sharpened, revealing a vast, simulated landscape in front of him. A cold, barren world stretched out in all directions, dotted with resources and key territories waiting to be claimed. It was a battlefield like no other, where brute strength meant nothing, and the only weapon that mattered was the mind. For most, it was a foreign arena. For Lior, it was home. As his mental connection to the grid strengthened, Lior's fingers moved instinctively, commanding his virtual army with precision. Each decision was calculated, each movement intentional. His competitors, now nothing more than digital avatars on the screen, began their assault, eager to claim dominance in this war of intellect. But Lior was already 3 steps ahead. Despite his initial doubts, this was where he belonged. His mind, sharper than any blade, worked swiftly. His competitors had no idea what was coming. Most were brute force strategists, throwing their armies at objectives without consideration. Lior, on the other hand, watched and waited. Every advance his enemies made was met with silence from Lior's side. He let them move freely, let them think they were gaining the upper hand. But in reality, every inch they claimed was a trap set to ensnare them later. Not everyone, though, was ignorant of his capabilities. Garrick, one of the fiercest competitors, towered over the rest, both physically and mentally. His strength lay in his ability to intimidate his opponents, and he had already bulldozed his way through the earlier rounds. He made no secret of his disdain for Lior. "You're wasting your time," Garrick sneered, his voice booming across the grid. "Brains alone won't win this war. Out here, only the strong survive." Lior ignored the taunt. Words had no place in the battle he was waging. But he could feel the weight of the judgment in Garrick's statement. It wasn't just the taunt of a competitor, it was the sentiment of the entire galaxy, a world that believed only the physically strong were worthy of victory. For most of his life, Lior had allowed that belief to burrow deep into his mind, convincing him that his physical limitations were a weakness. But now, in this virtual battlefield, there was no wheelchair, no fragile body to hold him back. Here, Lior was free to be the strategist he was always meant to be. As the battle raged on, Lior's unorthodox strategies began to unfold. Instead of confronting his opponents head-on, he diverted them, drawing their forces into terrain that was harder to navigate. When Garrick sent a massive wave of units to overwhelm him, Lior responded with surgical precision. He didn't meet the force with brute strength, he dismantled it piece by piece, leading Garrick's forces into choke points and ambushes that drained them of resources and left them vulnerable. The crowd, watching from the stands, began to notice. The boy they had written off as weak, as broken, was controlling the battlefield with an ease that left them stunned. But success didn't come without its challenges. Halfway through the battle, just as Lior was gaining ground, his neural link flickered. It was subtle at first, a delay in command here, a slight hesitation there. But soon, it became worse. The commands he sent to his army were slow to execute, and his strategy began to fall apart. His enemies noticed the lapse immediately, and seized the opportunity. Garrick, seeing the moment of weakness, pressed his advantage. "You thought you could outthink me, cripple?" His taunts rang louder, more vicious. "I told you, you don't belong here." Lior's heart pounded in his chest. His hands, shaking, hovered over the controls, but the link refused to respond. He was losing ground. The carefully laid traps and strategies began to unravel, and his enemies capitalized on every mistake, pushing him back further and further. The tide was turning, and the hopelessness he had fought so hard to suppress began to creep back in. Maybe Garrick was right. Maybe this wasn't his place. Maybe he wasn't strong enough, not in the way the galaxy demanded. It was too much, the pressure, the weight of everything he had to prove. For a brief moment, Lior considered giving up, withdrawing from the battle entirely. What was the point? He had tried, but even his mind, his greatest weapon, was failing him. But then Marcus's voice cut through the noise. "Lior! Don't you dare give up now. This battle isn't about them. It's about you." Lior blinked, his breath catching in his throat. Marcus's voice was steady, filled with a quiet strength that Lior hadn't heard before. "You've come too far to let them decide who you are. You think this is about strength? Strength isn't about muscles. It's about heart. You've got that. You've always had it. Now show them." Lior clenched his fists, his mind reeling. The battlefield in front of him was a mess, his forces scattered, his resources dwindling. But Marcus's words echoed in his ears, and he realized something. This wasn't about winning in the traditional sense. It wasn't about overwhelming his enemies or proving he could be like them. This was about showing them that victory came in many forms, and heart was the most powerful weapon of all. With renewed focus, Lior took a deep breath. His neural link flickered again, but this time, he didn't panic. Instead of trying to regain control of the entire battlefield, he concentrated on one thing: Garrick. The brute who had mocked him, underestimated him, and now thought he had the upper hand. Lior's eyes narrowed. If he was going to go down, he was taking Garrick with him. With precision, Lior funneled the last of his resources into a final trap. He let Garrick believe that he was cornering him, allowed the brute's army to surge forward. But Lior had one last move to play. Just as Garrick's forces closed in, Lior triggered a hidden contingency. His remaining units swarmed into position, collapsing Garrick's entire front line in a single, calculated strike. Garrick's bellow of rage echoed through the grid as his forces were obliterated. Lior's heart raced, his mind sharp and clear despite the strain of the neural link. The crowd gasped, the momentum of the battle shifting once again. For the first time, Lior felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't just the satisfaction of winning a skirmish. It was pride. Not the pride that came from proving himself to others, but the pride that came from knowing he hadn't given up. That even when the odds were stacked against him, he had fought with everything he had. He heard Marcus's voice again, softer now, but filled with that same quiet strength. "There it is. That's what heart looks like." Lior, breathing heavily, whispered to himself. "Then I'll show them what heart really looks like." He wasn't done yet. Lior's mind raced, even as his body ached with exhaustion. The neural link had strained him, leaving him on the verge of collapse, but there was no time to dwell on the physical toll. This was it, the final stage of the tournament. The vast simulation before him had turned into a chaotic battlefield, with only a few competitors left standing. Garrick, despite the losses he had suffered at Lior's hands, still loomed large in the field, his forces regrouping, his confidence undiminished. Lior had weakened him, yes, but Garrick's sheer size and brute force were relentless. And now, as Lior's own resources dwindled, the fatigue of the prolonged mental battle began to set in. His strategic moves, once crisp and decisive, started to slow. He could feel the weight of it, the pressure to keep going, the doubts that lingered in the back of his mind. Was this where it ended? Would everything he had fought for fall apart at the very last moment? But Marcus's voice echoed in his head, the words from earlier still resonating deeply. "Strength isn't about muscles. It's about heart." Lior clenched his fists, pushing the exhaustion to the side. He couldn't stop now. Not after everything. Garrick may have been stronger in the traditional sense, but Lior knew something Garrick didn't. Victory didn't always go to the one with the biggest army or the strongest weapons. Victory went to the one who could outthink, outmaneuver, and stay one step ahead. His eyes scanned the battlefield, quickly assessing what he had left to work with. It wasn't much. A handful of units, barely enough to mount a defense, let alone a full-scale assault. But Lior didn't need an army. He just needed Garrick to think he did. His mind clicked into gear, forming a strategy that would turn Garrick's strength into his greatest weakness. Lior set his plan into motion. He sacrificed a large portion of his remaining forces, sending them directly into Garrick's path. As expected, Garrick took the bait, driving his massive army forward with a roar of confidence, believing he was on the verge of crushing Lior for good. The brute's forces moved like a tidal wave, swallowing up Lior's sacrificial units with ease. From Garrick's perspective, it must have seemed like Lior had given up, like the final blow was just moments away. But Lior was waiting for this exact moment. As Garrick's forces closed in, Lior executed the final phase of his strategy. He had spread his remaining forces thin, hiding them in strategic locations across the battlefield, waiting for Garrick's army to commit fully to the assault. Once Garrick's forces were deep enough, Lior sprang the trap. His hidden units surged forward, not to engage Garrick directly, but to cut him off from his resources, to isolate his forces and leave them stranded in enemy territory with no support. It was a high-risk move, one that required precision timing and flawless execution. But Lior had spent his entire life mastering the art of strategy, and this was where he excelled. Garrick, overconfident and blindsided, didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. His massive army, now deep in enemy lines, was trapped. Lior's forces, though small in number, had encircled him, cutting off Garrick's supply lines and pinning his troops in a position where their size and strength were meaningless. The crowd, watching the battle unfold on the massive screens overhead, gasped in shock. For so long, they had seen Lior as the underdog, the fragile boy who had no business in this tournament. But now, they were witnessing something extraordinary. Lior's brilliance wasn't in brute strength, but in his ability to turn the battlefield into a chessboard, every move calculated, every piece in place for the final checkmate. Garrick's army, deprived of resources and unable to retreat, began to crumble. Panic set in as his forces collapsed under the weight of their own overextension. Lior, calm and steady despite his exhaustion, watched it all unfold with a quiet satisfaction. Garrick's defeat was inevitable now, not because Lior had more firepower or a larger army, but because he had outthought his opponent at every turn. In a matter of moments, the final blow was struck. Garrick's army, decimated and disorganized, fell apart completely. The battlefield was silent, save for the sounds of the virtual simulation fading away. Lior, breathing heavily, could hardly believe it. He had done it. He had won. The arena, for a brief second, was stunned into silence. And then, as the realization sank in, the crowd erupted in a deafening roar of approval. Lior, the boy who had been dismissed and ridiculed, the competitor who had been underestimated by everyone, had emerged victorious. The shock and awe in the audience were palpable, but so was the admiration. No longer was Lior seen as weak or frail. He had proven himself a true champion. As the dust settled, Marcus approached Lior, his expression a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time since the tournament began, Marcus allowed himself to truly smile. He had always known Lior had it in him, but seeing the boy pull off such a stunning victory filled him with a sense of redemption. It wasn't just about Lior winning, it was about both of them finding something they had lost along the way. Lior, still catching his breath, looked up at Marcus. His exhaustion was clear, but so was the spark of triumph in his eyes. "I never could have done it without you," Lior admitted quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the cheering crowd. Marcus shook his head, crouching down to Lior's level. "No, kid," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You always had it in you. I just reminded you of what you were capable of." The two shared a moment of silence, the noise of the arena fading into the background. It was a moment of mutual respect, of understanding that they had both helped each other in ways either of them had expected. For Lior, it was the validation that he had always needed, not from the galaxy, but from himself. For Marcus, it was the redemption he had longed for after years of carrying the weight of his past failures. As the crowd continued to cheer, celebrating the new champion of the galactic tournament, Lior and Marcus stood together, not as mentor and student, but as equals. They had both fought their battles, one of the mind, the other of the heart, and in the end, they had both won. The final message was clear. Victory wasn't about physical power or dominance. True strength came from within, from the heart and mind working together. Lior had proven to the galaxy that one's worth wasn't defined by their body, but by their will to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed impossible. In that moment, both Lior and Marcus understood that they had found something far greater than a tournament win. They had found their own sense of worth, their own sense of strength. And that was a victory no one could ever take away from them.